I'll run through the purpose of the webinar and our goals, and then I'll introduce each of the speakers and a very short bio, which they've kindly provided, and then we'll go into the presentation straight away. Do I have any questions, mostly from the panelists for now, and then hopefully we'll get through any other questions from the audience in a bit. Any questions, panelists? New? Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everyone. For those who've joined and those who are still seem to be coming through. My name is Gemma. I'll be moderating this panel on the role of BBNJ, the newly minted BBNJ agreement, in addressing climate action. We have the very distinguished privilege, honor to hear from three great panelists. I'll introduce them in a second, but this webinar is part of a series of webinars in support of our project for capacity building for SIDS, for early ratification of BBNJ. And this project is hosted by Ocean Voices. So our goal for today is to hear from our three presenters, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end. The three presenters, and I'll go through in order of presentations. Firstly, we'll hear from Kathryn Audroing. Kathryn is an environmental scientist with a special interest in marine species and ecosystems. She is currently engaged with a conservation NGO, which works to conserve sea turtles while empowering coastal communities in Trinidad and Tobago. Kathryn manages a national sea turtle conservation program and other conservation initiatives with communities. Her research focus is on community-directed biodiversity management. Kathryn, can you just give us a wave so we know which one is you, please? Yay. Then we will hear from Lisa Levin, a distinguished professor emerita at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in University of California. Lisa is a former director of the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at Scripps. Her research examines the biodiversity of deep continental margin ecosystems, the effects of climate change, especially ocean deoxygenation, and human impacts on deep ocean. She has played leadership roles at DOSI and DOOS. Dr. Levin is active in bringing climate science to policy and has contributed to multiple IPCC reports, UNFCCC Ocean Dialogues, World Ocean Assessments, and the BBNJ Agreement and International Seabed Authority negotiations. Dr. Levin, I think you gave us a wave earlier, but just one more. Yeah. And then finally, we'll hear from, last but not least, Angelique Pouponneau. Angelique is an environmental lawyer. She holds an LLM in environmental law, specializing in law of the sea and natural resources law. Angelique previously held a position as the Chief of Staff to the UN Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action and Just Transitions. Angelique also has served as policy and strategy advisor on ocean and climate matters to the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, to the EOSIS chair. And prior to that, held the position of CEO for Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, I think more widely known as SECAT. So we have three excellent panelists, very wide range of expertise, and we very much look forward to hearing from them on how we can do more for the climate under the new BBNJ regime. So firstly, I'll hand over to Kathryn to kick us off with a presentation. Kathryn, the floor is yours. Do you have slides? Okay, awesome. I do believe you have screen sharing privileges. Excellent. So over to you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Gemma, and good day to everyone. And yes, especially thankful for that very gracious introduction, Gemma. So as she explained, I am Kathryn Audroing, an Ocean Voices Fellow currently, and also the research manager at conservation NGO in Trinidad and Tobago, the Turtle Village Trust. Just 1 second. Verifying my screen share. Okay, so I'm going to give a bit of a kind of local perspective, or somewhat of a case study, essentially, of the impacts of climate on local communities and of highly migratory species. In this case, it's going to be the leatherback sea turtles, and from the perspective of Trinidad and Tobago and the work that we do in terms of the conservation of these species. So to start with, to give you a kind of a world view of where are the leatherbacks of the world. So it's mapped out here quite nicely. The nesting areas in the orange. So the larger the size is kind of a scale to the abundance of the nesting that happens in those areas. So you can see there's some really big, bright orange sectors where we are in the Southern Caribbean here in Trinidad and Tobago, highlighted in the smaller map to the top of the screen. You can see that we are one of the major nesting areas and have been for some time now. That's globally. And then this map also gives us an idea of where sea turtles are moving. And I know because of the concern with areas beyond national jurisdictions that this webinar is covering, you'd be very keen to see the high seas areas are very actively used, in darker, rich purple, signifying the larger number of nesting, satellite tracking that's happening in those areas. So either more turtles or in general, more activity in these areas. So the population I am referring to could be looked at here as a Northwest Atlantic population. So anywhere between the North American continent and the South American continent, extending as far as the British Isles and European West Coast, as well as the African West Coast. And this map kind of signifies like all of the demographic information we have about the populations of the world. So mixing with the nesting information, satellite tracking information, or offshore monitoring information, mixed with the genetic diversity that we see. So we can see that there are at least there are a couple of different subpopulations which would be looked at like an IUCN level. So then there's small groups of them around the world, and specifically the population that I interact with is the Northwest Atlantic population, which, if we look a little bit more closely, have 5 distinct genetic units, and Trinidad and Tobago being one of those 5. And it's very well noted that more than 70% of the leatherback sea turtles that are encountered offshore of Nova Scotia in Canada are of the Trinidad genetic stock. So it's really critically important for not just for the shared nesting abundance that we have, but also for the role that the population plays in keeping the genetic diversity going. So what happened is in 2018, kind of in response to some conversations that we were having as regional managers of the resource, we stopped and had an assessment of what's happening specifically to our subpopulation, so the Northwest Atlantic population, and we looked at data from over 30 nesting sites, 10 countries kind of, and over the longest possible period that we could have got standardized data collection, which turned out to be from 1990 to at that time, which was 2017. And there were over 877,000 nesting records monitored, and we saw that overall there was a decline, a trend, a negative trend, essentially, so that there's need for intensive conservation actions to ensure that there's the sustained population going forward. So out of that, obviously, then it triggered a reclassification in the IUCN. So in 2019, the Northwest Atlantic leatherback population was moved to endangered. And yeah, the outcome being that without sustained conservation effort, the population was at risk of collapse. So given all of that information from like a global and then regional and now to our local perspective here in Trinidad and Tobago, so the southernmost islands of the Caribbean archipelago, we have several nesting beaches, but 3 major ones for the leatherbacks, 2 on the east coast, Matura and Fishing Pond, about 5 and 7 kilometers each. They support the same amount of nesting as a 1 kilometer beach on the north coast of Trinidad, which is Grand Riviere Beach. So, and they're the only beaches within the Caribbean at the moment that can see 1,000 nesting events per year. But in fact, in Grand Riviere, which is differentiated from the East Coast beaches in that it's also within the community that's like a community borders the beach itself. As you can see here in the map, we can see the different residences and that. The fact is that at any one night, the number of nesting turtles on the beach can outnumber the number of residents, which is 300 residents within the community. So the threshold of having 1,000 nesting events in a year is greatly surpassed in Trinidad and Tobago, unlike most of the other rookeries for the Northwest Atlantic population. So, and as you can also see from the map, the Grand Riviere community gets its name from this large river that's coursing through its east border, which also influences the size and volume of the beach available for nesting activity. And so essentially with climate activity or any weather activity, really, it reshapes the beach quite significantly. And with increased climate action, there's a long-term threat that the beach cannot sustain the population that it does currently. And so bearing from that, and from the fact that this is the height of the 2022 nesting season in June 2022, where not only the roadways were blocked by fallen trees after a single weather event, not a storm, not a tropical depression, not a hurricane, just one single rainfall event entirely reshaped the beach so that you can see there are some exposed eggs, sea turtle eggs here that have been washed down. The scarp on the shoreline is now at least 5 feet in depth. So this one single event kind of triggered within the community a significant concern for what could future and actually named weather events bring to their livelihoods, because not only are they interested in what's happening with the sea turtles as a biodiversity resource, but it also is a major income resource through ecotourism activity within the community. So this here is another one-off event that happened actually earlier this year in May of 2024, where just an overnight rainfall event triggered this level of debris to wash down not the major Grand Riviere River, but actually a dry river that's normally not flowing consistently. So this caused this level of debris to wash down the river and unfortunately trap one of the nesting leatherback females in it, who was subsequently, of course, freed by the community. So it was events like this that exposed the extent of eggs that we see here. So if you can look as far into the distance into the photograph, you can just see how many thousands of eggs have been exposed by single rainfall events. And Trinidad and Tobago has been fortunate not to have been struck by any hurricanes or significant storm events for at least 30 years now. So this is just rainy season, wet season rainfall events. So it kind of triggered within the community a concern for what could be the future of this nesting beach and the resource that are the sea turtles. So from that, and coupled with the fact that I was undertaking a fellowship research with the Ocean Voices program, I worked with the community and we designed a project to give us a better understanding of what are the climate impacts we're facing, what sort of resilience and adaptation strategies could be built in within the community. So it started off with just like what you see here, these stakeholder sessions where we would clarify concepts of climate and understand what impacts and models we're seeing about what would be happening in Grand River, and then matching that with the lived experience of the community that's there. I mean, from all ages, you can see the primary school aged all the way up to the seniors within the community, just getting from them an impression of what it is they were facing, what sort of prospects they had, and then seeing within that conversation that there were solutions, localized solutions that they already had put in place, or they have also ideas of how they can work towards ensuring that without any sort of like interventions at the government level or state level, which are few and far between because really we're resource strapped, what could be done to ensure that not only their own property and infrastructure were saved, but also the livelihood resource that the sea turtles were there. So out of that, I tried to work alongside them to develop a primary data set for what's happening that could influence local policy and hopefully make it all the way up to kind of like regional or international policy on designing an adaptation strategy that's born out of what evidence they can collect about the impact of climate on the beach. And the turtles, being the charismatic species, would then be able to tell the story of what's happening. So what we did was we looked at one climate parameter, in this case, temperature, because sea turtles are their sex is determined by the temperature in which the eggs incubate. So we looked at the fact that if there are, as predicted, increased temperatures long term, that it would impact the viability of the nest, so the amount of hatchlings that could be produced, and also the sex ratios between male to females. Whereas we'd ideally like to have a 1-to-1 ratio. In a warming climate, we'd have a future of predominantly female turtles, which signifies a loss of genetic diversity long term, and also then there would be also limitations for the space because each female turtle will need to utilize nesting beach. Nesting beach is being eroded now, and then we know that we expect increased sea levels, so we'd have losses long term. So we undertook to do a full data set of determining the temperature changes within the sand on the beach and tell a story of how the community would work towards developing an adaptation strategy that benefits the sea turtles and the beach habitat long term, and also obviously has benefits for them as a community. So we looked at the data that they got, and unfortunately, it showed quite significantly. So that dashed red line you see is where we would get a 50-50 ratio of male to females. And we could see that under all of the sunny conditions that the nests were above the lethal threshold. So quite likely those nests would not survive. And then if they did, they would predominantly produce female sea turtles. And then there were incidents where within the nest itself, you could see that it went over the threshold. And we looked at the variation that would happen with depth and also with the different months of the nesting period. So depending on where the sea turtle nest, between going from the dry season in early March all the way to the rainy season in August and July. And then it came back to us, sitting down, talking with the stakeholders. I mean, really all ages, all experiences, all backgrounds, and trying to work out what sort of adaptation strategies could be realized within their communities. And it's now for us to take the message and actually build it out and get into those policy engagement arenas and start discussing what's happening within the community, the knowledge base that they have from conducting the research on their own and actually having evidence that can be scrutinized and taken from like a sound perspective, a science-based perspective for the adaptation strategies that they have in mind. And really, it's just like looking at it from what our lived experience is this kind of top-down approach and realizing that for the most part, the local action comes in at the end of whatever's been designed, either first internationally and then broken all the way down to the national level. And then looking at it from now, the perspective that we would like to have going forward, where we're going now from the local perspective globally. So we're taking that nice local knowledge base, the experience, the solutions that exist within community, using that to empower the future generations going forward, actualizing some of the resilience capacity that exists within the communities, knowing that they have the solutions already and they just really need support. And then, yeah, kind of working in that space alongside them to develop a climate adaptation policy that meets what's happening globally and matches it with what's happening locally, and allowing for that kind of natural exchange to happen where the stakeholders are supported, and then the benefit is to the communities, to the ones who feel the impacts of climate firsthand and the loss of the biodiversity that they care so much about and that they earn their livelihood from. And really, all of this was done with support from the Ocean Voices program. So it's a thank you to the University of Edinburgh Nippon Foundation Ocean Voices program. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Always love hearing about your work and all the things that you do. Maybe just to pin in everybody's mind as well, the work that the Turtle Conservation Trust has also done has really changed hearts and minds in the area, so that and has really changed how leatherback turtles are perceived, not from going from a source of food to a source of livelihood. So the community is now vested in how this small section of biodiversity is conserved. We do have a slight change in our program. So I'm just going to hand over to Angelique to take us through her section on how states can include the high seas as part of their MBSAPs to address climate change. So I'll hand over to Angelique and really look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Gemma, and apologies everyone. The change is because of me. So if the program seems a little clunky, it's definitely my fault. Lisa would have set the scene brilliantly with highlighting the linkages between climate, ocean, and biodiversity. But you'll be hearing from me first, and I'll be speaking about what was a really amazing development that happened just this year, where we had an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea delivered. And I submit of my argument or my presentation here today is that the advisory opinion makes the case for high seas protection. And of course, the BBNJ agreement provides us with an avenue and tool to do so. So I think it's worth perhaps just highlighting I'm going to put my timer on so I don't spend all of our time on this. So what I think is worth highlighting is just already the leadership of small island developing states. It was the Commission on Small Island States, I believe, COSIS, chaired by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu and other members who were able to bring this advisory opinion before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. And its findings were really progressive, really something that is able to help us advance the ocean and climate nexus. And one of the things in relation to that is it recognizes this important role of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, where it says the ocean is a fundamental climate regulator on seasonal to millennial timescales. So already recognizing the importance of the ocean and the role that it plays when it comes to regulation of climate. And it goes on because the IPCC talks about how the ocean stores heat trapped by the atmosphere caused by increased concentration. So really talking about the ocean as a carbon sink, and it goes on to store excess carbon dioxide, and such carbon storage represents a major control on atmosphere carbon dioxide, especially because of the excessive anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that we have. But what's very interesting is the IPCC never makes any distinction between ocean within or beyond national jurisdiction. So it's talking about the ocean broadly. And I think they're important to recognize that role. Moreover, the IPCC, and it does have a coastal wetlands supplement, really recognizes the role of three coastal wetlands or three habitats, seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes, that the IPCC says it's characterized by high yet variable organic carbon storage in their soils and sediments, and have sequestered carbon dioxide from the atmosphere continuously over thousands of years. And because of this focus on seagrasses and mangroves and salt marshes, everybody kind of said they must be talking about coastal waters, right? That's typically where you see mangroves, and that's typically where you you know of where seagrass meadows are, sort of nearer to shore. But of course, and I'm really glad to see Sheena Tama on the call, seagrass meadows are not only found along the coast. There are areas of shallow waters that exist in the high seas, for example, the Saya de Mala in the Western Indian Ocean. And this is an area that sits on a sandbank. There is concentration of seagrass meadows. There are, there's a need to decipher just how much, but it is a recognition that there are these what's deemed coastal habitats, but of course not always coastals, that are sitting and able to perform these functions in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I'll use this broadly because it sits on a bank. It can be straddled between within and beyond because of the extended continental shelf. But most important is finding number one of ITLOS, where the International Tribunal of the Sea, which I'll refer to as ITLOS, where it says anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere constitutes pollution to the marine environment, right? And this is super important in recognizing that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions under the law of the sea is now said to be pollution to the marine environment. And there are obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention that we must preserve, and we must preserve the marine environment. And of course, that includes taking all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution from into the marine environment. So what is really fascinating, though, is the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea basically says, yes, you have this obligation under the Law of the Sea Convention, but wait a minute. A group of parties, a group of people who, not parties, a group of member states who made submissions actually said, but I don't have to do more than submit my nationally determined contributions or my national climate plans, which falls under the Paris Agreement, right? And that every member state every 5 years must submit these national climate plans. And that the tribunal says, wait a minute. No. You cannot simply satisfy your obligation under the Law of the Sea Convention by doing what it says in the Paris Agreement. You have to do more, right? And here it recognizes that the Paris Agreement complements the convention, but does not in any way supersede it, and that states do have an obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And if the state fails to comply with this obligation, international responsibility would be engaged for the state. And here a more technical point, so I won't get into it about the relevance of Paris, whether it is lex specialis or not. So I'll just skip over the slide. But what the AO, the advisory opinion, also does is it actually recognizes the role of marine protected areas and indicates that it recognizes one of the IPCC report of Working Group 2, and says MPAs and other marine spatial planning tools have great potential to address climate change mitigation and adaptation in ocean and coastal ecosystems if they are designed and implemented in a coordinated way that takes into account ecosystem vulnerability and responds to projected climate conditions. Again, here, no distinction between beyond or within national jurisdiction, but recognizes that MPAs and marine spatial planning tools can actually be a realistic strategy to respond to climate change. The advisory opinion goes even further to, and it cannot do much more than note it, I suppose, given it hasn't entered into force. But the tribunal notes that the recently adopted BBNJ agreement expresses the need for a global framework under the convention to better address conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, and provides for the use of area-based management tools, including MPAs, right? So it already acknowledges that there is an incoming role for the BBNJ agreement because parties or states are able to adopt more rigorous measures to protect and preserve the marine environment, whether they want to, and as long as it is consistent to international law. I suppose one thing I don't want to do is let anyone off the hook by saying we must do ocean action and then we will all be fine. We'll have these great NPAs in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, and we'll take care of climate. So whichever convention that we are referring to, whether it is the United Nations Framework Convention on the Law, Framework Conventions on Climate Change, or it is the Convention on the Law of the Sea, my final message is we need deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with a 1.5 degrees pathway, but it can be complemented with other forms of climate action, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation through the use of ocean climate action in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. It's always good to hear from you. We really like it when lawyers like us come and we can pass out certain aspects of the conversation that maybe our marine scientists are having. And I really like how you mentioned that IPCC doesn't differentiate between areas within and areas beyond national jurisdiction, because that is a made-up line that humans negotiated based on political alliances and whatever political support that they could gain. So I think that that's a really great fact to leave everybody with, that these treaties that we negotiate, they very much based on political will. But now we're starting to see more need for science, and I really hope that that is a good way to segue back to Lisa. And I will invite you, Lisa, now to start your presentation on enabling how to enable a climate positive BBNJ agreement, which I'm super excited to hear about. Thank you so much.
Okay, just checking in to see that you can hear me and you can see my slides.
Yep,
Yes.
can do both.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to be on an Ocean Voices webinar with the other esteemed speakers, and I've already learned a lot this morning. for me, it's morning. So I am so I've started my slide here with the Taniwha, which is sort of the Maori guardian of the deep. But I put it there to encourage us to think about how we can use the high seas or ensure that the high seas help to protect the deep ocean. And that's really my focus as a deep sea biologist. So both the surface and the deep. I will focus on what the linkage is between biodiversity and climate, and in particular, the roles played by the waters beyond national jurisdiction in climate and the carbon cycle. I'll briefly mention some of the political instruments that are involved in regulating the ocean that can affect climate. And then I'll talk mainly about, well, at least partly about many of the climate opportunities that I see in the 4 elements of the BBNJ agreement, and then some of the climate-related issues of actions being proposed for the deep ocean in terms of deep seabed mining and bringing carbon dioxide removal. But let me just start. I think most of the people watching this webinar are quite familiar with the strong linkage between biodiversity and climate. We know that biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction is very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, both of warming, deoxygenation, and acidification. And that when we think about protecting biodiversity, we have to take into consideration the effects that climate change will have on that biodiversity, including changing species distributions and viability, changes in habitat suitability and compression of habitats, and altered migration patterns. We also recognize that biodiversity underpins the carbon cycle and carbon sequestration, and that biodiversity protections need to incorporate and prioritize these functions. And then I'll come back to this at the end of this presentation to recognize that some proposed ocean-based climate mitigation efforts might not succeed if they harm the biodiversity that provides these important functions. We really need to find ways to take actions that are both biodiversity positive and climate positive. So Angelique already talked about the important role of the ocean. We know it absorbs a significant amount of heat, but with some consequences, including oxygen loss and declines in productivity. And we know it absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, probably closer to 1/3, but this results in ocean acidification. And all these changes happen at the surface of the ocean, but there is only one ocean. It's totally interconnected, and the Great Conveyor Belt, or also known as thermohaline circulation, transports those surface waters into deep waters with consequences for the deep sea biodiversity. And that conveyor belt also controls our climate on land. And when it slows or it's not going to stop, but when it changes its speed or route, it affects droughts, wildfires, storms, and atmospheric rivers, all sorts of climate events. But the changes happening in the deep sea definitely do affect biodiversity. We are seeing, as a result of warming, eastward migrations of tuna and shoaling tuna distributions with big consequences for livelihoods and I would say for income in many West Pacific island nations. We know that the loss of oxygen in the ocean from climate change causes biodiversity loss in oxygen minimum zones and is compressing habitat, especially for big species that require, like tunas and billfish, that require a lot of oxygen. It's altering food webs, and we know that ocean acidification threatens our shallow water and cold water coral reefs and can cause loss of critical fish habitat and other associated biodiversity as well. So it's the whole ocean is affected, including the deep ocean. Let's see if I can advance here. We also know the ocean plays a really important role in removing carbon from the atmosphere. This happens physically through the conveyor belt that I spoke about, but it also happens through phytoplankton production and the biological pump. Phytoplankton, through photosynthesis, remove carbon, they aggregate and sink, or they're eaten by zooplankton, whose fecal pellets then sink. And also these zooplankton migrate vertically, and all of this acts to move carbon down into the deep sea. There are also roles for the big animals in the ocean that move carbon around horizontally, but especially vertically. The mesopelagic plankton migrations move carbon down massive amounts every single day. Vertical migrations of whales move carbon down and nutrients up and help fertilize the plankton. There are food webs and food chains that move carbon into the deep sea. Many of the fish and large mammals store huge amounts of carbon in their biomass, but also when they sink and die, especially the whales, they move carbon down into the deep ocean. And we always depict the deep ocean as a flat, featureless bottom like this, where the carbon will go and be sequestered. But in fact, we know there are many, many deep sea ecosystems on the seafloor that play important roles in carbon sequestration. It's not flat and featureless. I mentioned the vertical transport of carbon by animals, but many areas along our margins, like oxygen minima, sequester high amounts of carbon. Canyons and fjords sequester carbon. Cold water coral and sponge reefs do. Some of our vast abyssal plains host huge amounts of carbon in the seabed. Seamounts have a very high biomass of both invertebrates and fish that sequester carbon. We know methane seeps along continental margins. There are many, thousands of them, and they filter methane and that is emitted from the deep sea floor and keep it from getting into the atmosphere and making climate change worse. Both the animals and microbes do that. And they produce carbonate rock that locks up methane, and then hydrothermal vents fertilize the surface waters, introducing iron and other nutrients that also enable production and carbon sequestration. So the deep sea has a huge role to play in the carbon cycle. Only 2% of deep sea sediment carbon stores are in protected areas right now. We also know that biodiversity in the deep sea is vulnerable not only to climate change, but to direct human activities in the form of bottom trawling, ghost fishing, over harvesting and bycatch, the laying of cables, oil and gas extraction and spills, shipping, contamination, and some nascent activities like deep seabed mining and carbon dioxide removal technology all can threaten biodiversity and the carbon cycle services that are provided by that biodiversity in the high seas and in the deep seas. And also, as we know, many of these activities have their own carbon emissions, or they might release carbon on the seafloor by disturbing the seafloor and the organisms there. I want to home in on the last two I mentioned, deep seabed mining and marine carbon dioxide removal, of which there are a whole host of different technologies proposed. There are a lot of similarities between these in that they would be carried out over vast scales, often or sometimes either in the high seas or affecting the high seas. They're out of sight and out of mind. They pose significant environmental risks in poorly known deep sea ecosystems where they could alter the geochemistry, the substrates. They could smother organisms through sediment plumes or through deposition of phytoplankton and algae. They involve changes in marine ecosystems that probably will affect the carbon cycle. And there are really blurry lines between research, testing, and commercial deployment of all of these technologies, and there are many governance challenges as well as equity issues. And, you know, I could talk for a whole hour about those, but I'm not going to. I want to sort of move towards the BBNJ agreement, and it's important to think about the different organizations that manage climate. Angelique mentioned the UNFCCC. We always think of that as the primary climate regulator, but in fact, all these different UN organizations have, and of course, the different tribunals, including the ITLOS that we just heard about, and the London Convention and Protocol, all have a role in controlling both protections of biodiversity that can affect the carbon cycle, and in some cases, controlling emissions as well, the International Seabed Authority as well. So all of these are important, and we have the BBNJ agreement, without which I would say, you know, really addressing the high seas and the deep sea in international waters, none of these others can really be effective in managing climate. And I want to point out that climate change now appears in 6 places in the BBNJ agreement text. It appears in the preamble, which refers to climate change impacts on marine ecosystems, such as warming and ocean deoxygenation, as well as ocean acidification. It occurs in the use of terms referring to cumulative impacts, as including the consequences of climate change, ocean acidification, and related impacts. Climate appears in Article 7 under general principles and approaches, including to adverse effects of climate change and ocean acidification, and including the carbon cycling and maintaining and restoring ecosystem integrity, including the carbon cycling services that underpin the role of the ocean in climate. Part 3, under area-based management tools, addresses an objective of strengthening resilience to stressors, including those related to climate change and ocean acidification. Annex 1 has indicative criteria for identification of areas as vulnerability, including to climate change and ocean acidification. And Annex 2, which refers to types of capacity building and tech transfer, includes technology to address the adverse effects of climate change, such as warming and ocean deoxygenation, as well as ocean acidification. So that's where you can find climate spelled out in the BBNJ agreement. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can actually take the agreement elements to protect the climate. And I would say you've already heard about the importance of MPAs for climate. I would say to protect the ocean climate cycle, we could consider adding climate criteria to protect areas that are critical for productivity, carbon transfer, carbon storage, carbon burial, and sequestration. Right now, the criteria address vulnerability, but not the role of areas in the carbon cycle. So we could protect those areas. We could protect areas from activities that remove or release large amounts of carbon, like bottom trawling or seabed mining. We could protect areas vulnerable to climate change, deoxygenation, and acidification. We could protect habitat corridors, for example, the sea turtle migration pathways that you heard about, and protect climate refugia using climate models and climate projections. And it's, I think, also important to recognize we need to protect from the sea floor to the surface and from microbes to whales to confer climate resilience. The Part 4, which addresses environmental impacts, could build climate impacts into strategic environmental assessment. It could estimate greenhouse gas footprints and take measures to reduce these. It could assess climate intervention technology impacts. This would be marine carbon dioxide removal, and look at the risks. It can incorporate monitoring to detect climate-induced change, evaluate synergistic effects of climate change stressors with direct human disturbances under the cumulative impact component. And it could allow some adaptive management in a in a changing environment. We tend not to think of marine genetic resources as climate specific, but really, I would say the elements of the BBNJ agreement could help enable discovery and benefit sharing of genetic resource solutions to climate change. There are microorganisms that can scrub carbon and do all sorts of other amazing things in the ocean. We can develop best practices for access with regard to the carbon footprint and open access, and support adaptive and integrated use and conservation of genetic resources in the context of climate change. And then finally, the last element, capacity development and the transfer of marine technology can be used to empower global engagement and capacity to address biodiversity and climate together. I think there needs to be, across all nations, increased capacity for assessing and reducing carbon footprints, for evaluating marine carbon dioxide removal. We need to enable climate change impact monitoring and early warning systems and predictive modeling. We can encourage ecosystem approaches that link biodiversity to sustainable fisheries management to improve climate resilience. We can facilitate new observations and tools in remote and deep areas to record climate change and its impacts, and promote knowledge transfer of biodiversity-enabled climate services to incorporate their conservation into NDCs and other elements. So this is my final slide. I would say the BBNJ agreement has amazing potential, but to be effective, it's also going to have to work across all the other international instruments. So something to think about. And I want to thank the Blue Thread and Maureen Lesurf and co-authors for some of these ideas, which were written in another context, but I think it's really going to be important to have collaboration between the BBNJ COP when it ultimately happens with the CBD COPs and the UNFCCC COPs to support integrated policy planning. I think we could think about joint work programs between these different COPs to identify the best ocean-based options for addressing climate change. There could be workshops that bring the BBNJ science and technical body together with the IPCC and the IPBES to address some of the biodiversity climate action issues. We can highlight emerging science needs in key economic sectors. And again, I'll call out marine carbon dioxide removal and deep seabed mining and genetic resource bioprospecting as areas where we need more science. And we can introduce new elements possibly in the BBNJ that incorporate climate through work programs or voluntary commitments. And then, each COP, all these different instruments have indicators and monitoring frameworks, and I would encourage sharing these, again, to advance climate resilience. And I will stop there. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that really amazing presentation. I seem to be a primary learner, so beautiful colors always entice me, but also just the content was so engaging. It's really great to, I was quite surprised to hear your thought. I mean, the kind of the narrative around like ocean acidification and deoxygenation, as well as like all of the really kind of maybe nuanced changes in biodiversity availability, and habitats that I think as a policy advisor, we don't hear as much about, but there seems to be a very large body of science that's developed and is very clear now. So having, I think, this type of platform where we can interact both types of advisors is really important to kind of, build the bridges between us and see how we can better move this forward. We are starting to get some questions, and well, we've got one question in our Q&A panel, Q&A function box. Just checking if everyone else can see that question. Maybe we'll fire off with that. And also I will take the liberty as a moderator and ask my own question, which is how do our panelists see the interaction between the COSIS, the ITLOS advisory opinion, and the current proceedings for the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change with the work that you do? How do you see how do you see maybe the body of international law kind of morphing to fit a more, I want to say, relevant mold, a mold that is shaped by science and a better understanding of how the ocean informs climate change. And our question from one of our attendees, which I think is really important to kind of touch on, is how do we speak to climate deniers, or how do we speak to, I guess, countries who are more interested, or at least are more concerned with sustainable development and economics over the state of the climate. And I do agree with our anonymous poster, which is that, yes, many of us are already in the converted. We're already in the circle of the converted. And I think right now we try and think about how we have conversations with those who are not in this circle. So I will hand it over. That's two very big questions for all of you. Maybe if any of our panelists wants to go first, otherwise I might just ask Lisa if you might want to kick us off. So sorry.
Oh my. All right. Well, let me tackle the climate denials question first. And I might need you to repeat the first one because I sort of lost track of it. But, I think it's become very clear to everybody that tackling climate, whether you believe in it or not, whether you believe humans cause climate change or not, or whether you believe humans should be solving the problem or not, it makes economic sense. And the well-being and livelihood of everybody on the planet depends on addressing climate and using all the tools that we have that work to tackle mitigation and adaptation. And I would add conservation of the carbon cycle, which isn't mitigation or adaptation, but needs to be done. It makes sense I know there are countries whose higher priority is sustainable use of the ocean rather than protection of marine biodiversity, for example. But by protecting that biodiversity, their use of the ocean and the fisheries production and everything else is going to be so much better. And I guess, you have to just work from economic arguments from that this is, of course, a scientist speaking, so I'm sure all of you guys actually have better answers to that question. And I already forgot what the very first question was.
No worries. I think you actually kind of touched on it, which is how we bring different stakeholders together. And I will also maybe just briefly mention that myself, Kathryn, and Angelique all just came from the plastics negotiations in Busan, which did not yield a treaty, but perhaps at this point it was for the best. And maybe Angelique and Kathryn, maybe you can speak to how we're seeing the climate change, how we're seeing climate change arguments and science-based arguments really penetrate those political conversations. Because I think that to our anonymous questioner, we are seeing arguments in this space that it's more than just economics. And to exactly your point, Lisa, that a healthier planet supports more sustainable economies, more more economies with more resources to support the people. So maybe Angelique and Kathryn, if I can ask you, both maybe to reflect on your experiences in plastics and in other spaces, how this conversation is supporting climate change action in your respective fields. So Angelique for international law and policy, and Kathryn for your stakeholders on the ground, like the communities who need it the most.
I think Kathryn should go first. She said local action first, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, I would agree with you. Coming out of the recent negotiations in plastics, that we see like the conversation is more than just economics. It's more than just yeah, the bottom line for some countries, even though economics is very much in the forefront of the plastics negotiations, and the fact that, you know, we don't have elements like reducing plastic production, because then it'll have an impact on fossil fuel extraction and all of those economies that are going to be kind of under pressure from that sort of thing. Well, at least seemingly so, economic pressure from that. What should I say? I mean, the reality is we aren't one-dimensional. I mean, yes, economics is a very big aspect of a lot of what the negotiations involve, and a lot of what the political decisions of the day involve. But in reality, we do have the conversation of the social aspects of it, the cultural aspects of the work that of the life that the communities face, that we as a society face, that are under threat from major political decisions globally, and from the negotiations. So there's always going to be that need for a balance. And for the most part, I mean, Angelique said it in what you're saying, like the SIDS have really taken lead in a lot of that, and bringing to the forefront questions, even like what the question that we have in the chat is that, like, what is the role that like individuals can play, or like people within the negotiation space can play, but it's bringing to bear the reality of the circumstances that a lot of the countries are facing. And yes, SIDS helped bring ocean issues to the forefront, and then bring that up even in the plastics sphere. The fact that we have like plastics in the marine environment, that was on account of parties coming together, well, members coming together and negotiating as a block, and realizing, okay, look, we are all facing the same thing, so let's unite our forces. Let's say, okay, all of us are going to face climate impacts, whether we are in a small island developing state like I am from, or whether we're in a large continental mass. We are already seeing the impacts. We can see it in neighboring countries, even if we're not feeling it on our own at the moment. So we have to see collectively that we're stronger if we can unite on issues and bring them to the forefront as a collective, you know. So, and it means that we can't risk losing livelihoods, we can't risk losing traditions and cultures over political decisions like this. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You, Angelique.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think one of the things to appreciate, and I'll sort of quickly go up Kathryn's pyramid to the global space, but one of the things to appreciate is there is and this started to happen around I want to say 2021. There was an element of fatigue by many countries around the fact that many negotiation positions on a global landscape was being dominated by issues of economics, by issues of national and self-interest. And that's where I think that move towards going to the international judicial systems started to kick in, right? So I don't know if it's a fair correlation, but I'll always remember COP26 and SIDS being given this what was it, a loss and damage dialogue, when we requested a fund And then all of a sudden we started to, not all of a sudden, but I'm sure there was work being done behind the scenes, but we saw COSIS come up, the ICJ advisory opinion, Vanuatu and other colleagues come up to try and move some of these questions to the judicial space. And I think it's really telling that the tribunals, and fingers crossed on the International Court of Justice, are basically saying what they've said for a long time, right? Which is the issue of transboundary harm, and that we all have a customary international legal obligation to not harm others across our different boundaries. And so in that respect, I think these advisory opinions, and I know they are advisory opinions, so technically not legally binding, will continue to influence how international law is shaping. It will also can then be used more strategically by the sort of the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States that Kathryn spoke to in their leadership to move others by referencing what was said by these tribunals and the International Court of Justice. So I think there is a legal issue at hand, but also like a very strategic political dimension to this on how countries subsequently utilize the arguments of the tribunal to move countries beyond national interests. Given plastics, climate, the ocean remain transboundary issues. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Oh, sorry, Lisa, did you want to come in on anything? No? Okay, sorry, I'm just noting all that we're at time, but I'm really glad to not have to wrap up because I think those final thoughts from our panelists were really, really rich and just definitely what we needed. I do understand that the link for the recording will be available online on the ANCOR's website and will be also sent to all the participants. So I will maybe thank our panelists for taking the time to share their thoughts with us on these really important topics. I think it's very important that we have not only a bridge between our science and policy advisors, but also have the opportunity to share with a wider audience, especially on this really important issue, which is how to make the BBNJ more than a sustainable development. Let's find out where to fish from the ocean treaty. It's like, as Lisa outlined, it's very clear that it's not, but to take the words off the paper and put it into action, we're going to need more understanding around the science, more interlinkages between the policy advisors, those who are kind of forming the frameworks for how BBNJ will be operationalized. And of course, part of the wider question moving forward is how do we bring our global community into a more climate, maybe a climate focused conversation. And very important that Kathryn brought up, which is how do we ensure that our local communities on the ground, who play a really important role in maintaining biodiversity and protecting biodiversity, how do we ensure that they are also being part of the conversation? So with those final thoughts, I will close off. You will all receive a wonderful email from Vanessa with the recording and any other information. And please do feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. I believe all of their information, contact information, will be part of that later email. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your time. It was